Much has been said and written in relation to the one-year anniversary last Friday, February 24, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is horrific that in a so-called civilised world we have to witness this. As I've said many times, there are 195 nations in the world, and here we have one nation in an unapologetic, illegal and abominable course of action against one of its neighbours, Ukraine. There's no doubt that Putin is a butcher. And there is equally no doubt that democracy in Ukraine is far from being real. Zelensky, portrayed as a hero, is also the man who has banned a Christian faith in his country and arrested nuns and priests. Nonetheless, there is historical background to what's going on. It is conceded that the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles helped create the conditions for the rise of Hitler. But so saying, that doesn't make you a Hitler apologist. Well, on February 9, 1990, the US Secretary of State was James Baker. He then assured Mikhail Gorbachev, the then leader of the Soviet Union, that NATO would expand, quote, not 1 inch eastward, unquote. There were multiple assurances from the US, the UK, French and German leaders against NATO expansion. Gorbachev explained in his book, In a Changing World, that, quote, NATO's enlargement to the east, this is after he left office, NATO's enlargement to the east violated the spirit of the agreements reached during Germany's unification and undermined the multiple trust that had been built through arduous efforts, unquote. Gorbachev's successor, Boris Yeltsin, wrote in October 1993, and I quote, the spirit of the treaty of the final settlement with respect to Germany precludes, that means prevents, the option of expanding the NATO zone into the east, unquote. That leads to the legitimate question. Has the breach of these commitments given to Gorbachev and Yeltsin inspired Putin to undertake the current course of action? That does not excuse it. But nonetheless, when you've got talk of Finland and Sweden joining NATO and Ukraine, a de facto member of NATO, then NATO is seemingly in breach of the commitment given in 1990 to Gorbachev that NATO would expand, quote, not 1 inch eastward. Indeed, when the former CIA director William Burns became the ambassador to Moscow, he wrote in a memo in 1995, and I quote, hostility to NATO expansion is almost universally felt across the domestic political spectrum here. That was in Russia. So has all this led to the Russian narrative that America were maximising their strength in Europe at the cost of Russian interests and in breach of agreed undertakings to Russia? So where are we today? Well, firstly, some find it uncomfortable to admit, but when Trump was president, we didn't hear a squeak from the rocketman in North Korea, Xi in China, or Putin in Russia. Trump goes and all hell breaks loose. But now the universal view within the West seems to be that defeating the Russians in Ukraine, as the Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell has said, I'm going to try to help explain to the American people that defeating the Russians in Ukraine is the single most important event going on in the world right now, unquote. And that's a view argued by people like Boris Johnson, acknowledging that Putin's war has cost the lives of at least 60,000 Russian troops. Boris Johnson argues that Putin has failed, that, quote, the seemingly unstoppable force of the Russian military is breaking on the immovable object of Ukrainian resistance, unquote. And Boris says, quote, we must accelerate Western support for the Ukrainians and give them what they need to finish the job, unquote. Writes Boris Johnson, the Ukrainians have shown that they can do it. They have the energy and the courage to sweep Putin from their lands, and they have the inestimable psychological advantage that they're fighting for hearth and home. He says with the right tools, including more long-range artillery, they can punch through the land bridge, cut off Crimea, and deal a knockout blow to Russian forces, unquote. Boris continues, we should designate Russia a state sponsor of terrorism, placing that country where it rightly belongs on a list including Iran, Cuba, North Korea and Syria, unquote.